Good morning. I want to start off by thanking each of the media for being here and for your continued coverage throughout this incident. I also want to thank you for the respect that you've shown towards the family members that have been involved in this or affected by this tragedy. Today will be the final press conference related to this tragic incident that left 8 people dead and many more injured at the FedEx ground facility on April 15th earlier this year. Today, our goal is to add context into this lengthy investigation. That being said, we will remain focused on what is most important, and those are the 8 community members that lost their lives and the many more who were affected by the. Right now, we're going to have several people come up and be able to give context to this. As soon as they're complete, we will take questions. Right now, I would like to turn this over to IMPD Chief Randall Taylor.
Thank you all for coming. First of all, I want to thank the many members of this community and various partners that we had in this tragic incident. So first, the Indianapolis community. That includes all the businesses that stood up, the churches, the nonprofits, and the other entities that really helped us get through this tragic incident. As for the law enforcement side, specifically like to thank the Indianapolis State Police, the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, ATF, all of our other federal partners, the Marion County Crime Lab, the Marion County Coroner's Office, the FedEx security staff, of course our homicide investigators, the IMPD Chaplain's Office and IMPD Victim Assistance Unit, as well as all of our operations officers that responded to the FedEx facility on April 15th. These incidents are tragedies, something you never want your department or your community to ever go through. But back on April 15th of 2021, we went through this, to the loss of 8 individuals. But since the 15th of April, our investigators have done an outstanding job of investigating this incident and trying to find out the why. It's an answer that we know many of the families and friends of the family members want to know. It's what we want to know as well. Unfortunately, sometimes, even after months of deep investigations, not only by us, but by our partners, the why is still unknown. In this specific incident, that's something that only the shooter honestly knows, and we know we can't get anything from him. This was an attack on residents of Indianapolis, Indiana, the state of Indiana in particular, who were just trying to do their jobs, trying to provide for their families, trying to do what they felt was right, and they had the right to do when their lives were so tragically cut short. But the impact of this senseless shooting is not only felt here in Indiana, but it touched Americans across the country. All Americans deserve a safe place to work and live, and in Indiana, that's no different. Our officers will continue to do their best to make sure that those people who are working are able to do that safely. We'll review this incident. We'll strive to make changes where we see we can make changes to try to make sure that these kind of things don't happen again. Time will tell. Today, though, we have completed our investigation, so it's final for this particular incident. And for more on that, I will bring up Deputy Chief Craig McCart, Deputy Chief of our Investigations Unit.
Good morning. I'm Craig McCart, Deputy Chief of Investigations for IMPD. I'd like to thank you all for being here this morning. And I'd like to start by reiterating a little bit of what the Chief has already said. I just ask that we continue to focus on and remember the victims, their families, and those who have forever had their lives changed by this tragedy. And just ask that you continue to keep them in your prayers as they continue to heal and deal with the trauma that they've experienced. Also, I'd like to take a moment to offer a big thanks to all the organizations that we have leaned on so heavily since the very beginning of this investigation. I want to start by thanking the Indiana State Police. Certainly thank them for giving us this facility, letting us in here today. From the very beginning, there were troopers in the area that heard that call go out, and they responded right alongside the IMPD officers and responded to that chaos that was the scene at FedEx that night. Quickly after that, they provided us with detectives who helped to interview victims and witnesses. They again provided us with this facility as a place to do that, so we thank them for that. Thanks to the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and all of our federal partners. Again, the FBI has stood beside us from the very beginning, starting on the scene there that night, and kind enough to be here with us today to summarize their involvement in the investigation as well. ATF was there with us on the scene that night, and the U.S. Attorney's Office has been with us throughout the investigation as well. Thanks to Crime Lab and the Coroner's Office for all the hours that they've put in that started at the scene that night, and all of the Crime Lab worked tirelessly to process that scene and to get everything done, and the Coroner's Office had the difficult job of dealing with the families as they worked with them. Our Victim Assistance and Chaplain's Office were certainly a godsend to those families as they helped them navigate through that evening and continue to do so even today. The FedEx security staff, when I arrived on the scene, they were already working out of the back of an SUV with their computers to get us anything and everything they could, from video to employee records. And last but not least, I want to thank the heroes of IMPD who heard the men and women who heard that call go out that night and ran to the danger. They ran to the danger to keep all of us safe, much like they do every day. But obviously, this incident was a little different from what they had experienced in the past. Also, a special thanks to our homicide unit, particularly Dave Everman, who was the lead detective in this investigation. They have put in unbelievable hours and to be able to bring this to a close. So we have done an exhaustive and expansive investigation, and thank you guys for your patience allowing us to get to this point. We didn't really want to come here today until we were confident that we had gone down every road, looked at every piece of information that was available to us, and at this point we're confident that we've done that. And so we've brought this to a conclusion, and we want to be able to share a little bit about that with you today. So what I will do is I'm going to give a brief summary of the incident itself. Some of this is information that has already been released, and some of it is a little more detailed than what we've released in the past. And then after this, I will pass it off to Special Agent in Charge Paul Keenan to summarize the FBI's involvement. On April 15th, 2021, at approximately 10:54 p.m., the shooter arrived at the FedEx facility in his vehicle, that FedEx facility located at 8951 Mirabel Road. At the time that he arrived, it was close to shift change. It was also break time for many of those employees, break time and dinner time, and it was also payday on that day that he arrived. He sat in his vehicle for a short time before he entered the FedEx facility. When he entered, he approached a security officer that was working at FedEx. He had a conversation with him, which was reported to be a very normal conversation. He Specifically, he had inquired about his employment status with FedEx. As we reported before, he was a former employee at FedEx, I believe from August to October of 2020. So when he inquired about his status, he was told that he would need to speak with management about that, and management could be called to come up to the security desk to speak with him. After he was told that, he indicated that he was going to return to his car to get his work ID, his FedEx ID, and that he would be right back in. He left the FedEx facility and returned to his vehicle, and he stayed in his vehicle for several minutes. Shortly thereafter, an employee was walking down the sidewalk to enter in the employee entrance, and the shooter exited his vehicle with 2 rifles and began shooting at that employee who was walking down the sidewalk. The shooter then entered again, the employee entry locker room area and immediately began firing at employees that were gathered there in that area. He then turned his attention to try to gain further access into that facility, and he was unable to do that because of the physical security measures that were in place. However, he did fire more rounds at employees that were beyond that security area. After that, he exited the building, so he was only in the building that second time for actually less than 30 seconds. He then left the building, went back out into the parking lot. In the parking lot, he continued to shoot at employees and individuals that were in the parking lot as well as vehicles. He was very indiscriminate in his selection of his targets. Basically anything that was out in the parking lot, vehicles, people walking, he was firing rounds at them. While he was outside, there was also an employee who was outside. That employee was able to get his own handgun from the trunk of his vehicle and was able to fire 1 round at the suspect. That person then got back in his car and left the area for his own safety, and then he called 911, as did so many others. After this, the shooter continued to fire rounds outside the FedEx facility. He kind of walked up and down the sidewalk that was there in front of that facility and fired at anyone that was out there. He was outside for a little less than 3 minutes, and then he returned inside the facility in that locker room entryway, which is where he immediately took his own life. Officers arrived on scene shortly thereafter, began to make the scene safe and render any medical aid that they could to victims as they waited for IFD and Indianapolis EMS to arrive to provide medical treatment for those victims. Again, this was a very exhaustive, expansive investigation, and just some quick facts towards that. During the investigation, over 120 individuals were interviewed. There were over 20 search warrants and subpoenas that were issued and served. We had over 150 pieces of evidence that were collected from the scene that evening. In addition to that, there was a great deal of digital media that was seized and analyzed by the FBI. And so I'm going to turn it over to Special Agent in Charge Paul Keenan to speak a little bit about their analysis of the digital media and also talk about the FBI's involvement in the investigation. Thank you.
As the Deputy Chief said, my name is Paul Keenan. I'm the Special Agent in charge for the FBI in Indiana. First and foremost, I want to again offer my sincere condolences on behalf of the FBI to the victims, survivors, and families of all those involved in this horrific act of senseless violence, and to the community as well, which has also been impacted by this violent act. The FBI dedicated all necessary resources to follow every lead in this case and used all investigative capabilities to seek justice and hopefully bring a measure of understanding for the victims, their families, and for the community. FBI personnel assisted at the crime scene, conducted interviews, and assisted on the search of the subject's home. The IMPD requested the FBI's assistance in the review of all the digital media seized in the investigation. The FBI reviewed and provided analysis of 3 desktop computers, 1 flash drive, and 3 cell phones. In all, approximately 3 terabytes of data were extracted, imaged, processed, and reviewed. This was a laborious and lengthy process. As part of the investigation to determine the shooter's motivation for the attack, IMPD and FBI Indianapolis requested the assistance of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, or BAU. BAU provides investigative support and post-attack behavioral analysis of mass violence. The BAU conducted an extensive review of all available evidence and information gathered throughout this investigation. Based on this, BAU assesses that this was an act of suicidal murder, in which the shooter decided to commit suicide in a way which he believed would demonstrate his masculinity and capability while fulfilling a final desire to experience killing people. In the months prior to the attack, the shooter's suicidal thoughts occurred almost daily. The shooter's attack did not appear to have been motivated by the need to address perceived injustices or to advance an ideology. It was determined the shooter considered other targets, but chose the FedEx location because he was familiar with it and the pattern of activity at the site. FBI studies have found 73% of attackers had a previous connection to the target location. He also incorrectly believed he had identified a vulnerability which would have given him unobscured access to many potential victims. BAU assessed the shooter was similar in many ways to other perpetrators of targeted violence studied by the FBI. Targeted violence is a predatory act which is generally planned and purposeful and intended for an identified target. Preparation for his attack began at least 9 months prior, but it is unclear when the FedEx location was chosen as his target. Only the shooter knows all the reasons why he committed this horrific act of violence. However, at this time, the FBI is confident that, based on the evidence collected, the assessment of the Behavioral Analysis Unit is accurate, and the shooter did not appear to have been motivated by bias or a desire to advance an ideology. Thank you, and I will now introduce Acting U.S. Attorney John Childress.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is John Childress. I'm the Acting United States Attorney for the Southern District of Indiana. I first want to acknowledge the victims of this horrible tragedy. We can do little to replace what they have lost, but I would ask them to remember that they have our complete support now and going forward. I also want to thank my law enforcement partners for their unfailing efforts and professionalism in this investigation. The people of Indianapolis are fortunate to be served and protected by these extraordinary men and women. As you have heard, my office participated in this investigation and joined in the review and analysis of the evidence gathered. Following that review, we joined with our law enforcement partners in the conclusion that the suspect was primarily motivated by a desire to commit murder-suicide, exacerbated by personal mental health issues. We also joined in the conclusion that he acted alone and that others were unaware of his plans to commit this offense. I would like to be clear that this horrendous act was obviously criminal. Notwithstanding that fact, a prosecution could not be initiated due to the suspect's suicide. Thank you.
We can take questions now.
Deputy Chief McCord, could you talk about the FedEx employee that retrieved his own weapon and started shooting?
Sure, there's not a whole lot more to say, quite honestly. At the scene, there was evidence that indicated that that was a possibility, and then further in the investigation, detectives were able to identify someone that had indeed, to try to protect others at that scene that night, had gone and retrieved a firearm from their vehicle and fired one shot. That obviously really had no effect, but he did try to protect those around him, and then that's when he left the scene and called 911.
Was there any evidence that he was disgruntled in any way with FedEx, and can you address the end of his employment at FedEx? Had he been fired, resigned, quit?
Yeah, so there was really no indication that he had any issue with FedEx. In talking with other employees and FedEx personnel, he had never had any kind of an issue there. So he simply stopped showing up for work. So he lost his job simply by failing to show.
In the press statement here, it says based on interviews and documents reviewed by investigators in the months prior to the attack. Can you tell us a bit more about why that investigation was going on prior to the attack?
I think I'd have to look at that. I think you might be misreading it. I think it's referring to, during the investigation, we looked at documents and things that existed prior to the attack, not that we were actually investigating prior to the attack.
How long have you been planning an attack of some kind?
So I guess that depends on how you look at it, and I think Special Agent Keenan can probably address that a little bit more. But I mean, if we look at it in terms of when did he begin the purchase of things to carry out this act, we know that he started purchasing, weapons. I believe in July was the purchase of one of the weapons that was used, July of 2020. You want to say anything?
That's correct. When the BAU did their study, they were looking at trying to figure out when he started preparing for this, and the one solid piece of evidence that we have is the fact that he bought a gun that he used in the attack. So that's what we use as a starting point for his preparation. Preparation meaning buying things that he would actually use in the attack. It could have happened before then, and maybe it did, but that's a solid starting point, approximately 9 months before the attack.
Your description of his motivation as wanting to demonstrate his masculinity and capability, etc.
Yes.
Is there evidence in documents from what was recovered to support that, or is that purely BAU analysis?
So they get all of their information through the evidence that we gather in the field. So through interviews, through documents reviewed, through things we get through subpoenas and search warrants. In this case, as far as his masculinity goes, trying to prove he's a man, basically, by doing this act. He tried to live on his own at one point, failed to do that, moved back into his house, was having issues with that, so that's part of the whole masculinity part of it. The capability part of it, he was interested in the military, in joining the military. He'd actually began eating MREs, meals ready to eat, things like that, so that was the capability part that proved that he would be capable of doing something like this.
Is there documentary evidence, or there texts or emails or what have you, saying I'm going to show everybody, or is
No.
this just inference drawn from those things about him?
Inference drawn from interviews, mainly, yes.
What are the other locations he considered and why those other locations?
I'm not going to say exactly what the other locations are, but as I said in the statement, most 73% of mass shooters have some kind of connection to the site that they do the mass shooting. And he worked there for several months. He knew the location well. He knew that there would be a large group of people there that he would consider targets and we would consider victims, obviously.
So just to clarify, there was no target in the shooting. I know there was concerns from the Sikh community, but was it just shooting at random then? Is that fair to say?
Do you want to go over the sequence, or, I mean, We didn't find that it was a bias crime, if that's what you're asking. No, ma'am.
There was evidence of him looking at white supremacist websites previously. Was there anything else found?
So we did review his computers, his phones, everything. There was some viewing of mainly World War II Nazi-type propaganda. It was an extremely small percentage of his overall viewing. I believe we reviewed about 175,000 files on his computer, and it was somewhere in the neighborhood of less than 200 were files of mainly of German military, German Nazi things, but there was no indication that there was any animosity towards the Sikh community or any other group for that matter.
Do we know if the shooter, in fact, knew or had worked with any of his victims, or he may have actually knew who he shot?
Do you have any?
I don't think that we had any indication that he was known to any of those people. There were still certainly people who were employed at FedEx who knew him, but I don't believe, as far as we know, I don't believe that there was any connection between him and any of the victims.
And he never communicated his intent to any kind of family members or anybody else?
Communicated his intent? No, I think that's very fair to say that he did not specifically communicate that intent.
So in the Marion County Police Department indicated they took a rifle away from the gentleman while back. Is that true?
Correct. A shotgun,
IMPD too.
yes.
If they did that, there was no follow-up that this kid has a rifle because he was not, he shouldn't be able to carry it around.
Well, so we received a call that was initiated by his mother back in March of 2020, and she had concerns that he had that shotgun, and he had expressed again some suicidal ideations and possibly suicide by cops. So she notified IMPD. We confiscated that gun, and then we submitted that information to the prosecutor's office. Ultimately, he indicated that he did not want that gun back. So we were able to keep that gun. He never got that gun back in his possession, but then some months later, he was able to buy more firearms.
Chief, returning to the employee who fired the shot at the parking lot, he said that had no effect, to just miss, to be.
Right, exactly. He did not strike the victim or anyone else. I'm sorry, the shooter or anyone else.
The shooter arrived at 10:54. Do you know at what time he took his life, or approximately so how long the entire incident was from the time he arrived?
Well, so the entire actual incident.
When he arrived at work at 10:54, what time do you think he took his life?
I believe it was 11:08. I know the shooting portion lasted less than 4 minutes.
Can you talk about when you said he went in and he was deterred by some security members?
So I mean, without going into a lot of detail about FedEx's security policies, I think they can obviously speak better to that. But there was physical security that did not allow him to go further past that initial entry point where he was able to go into the locker room area, but then there's a security checkpoint, and there's actually physical security that prevents free access to that back area. Specifically, there are turnstiles, devices that keep people from going through there. And certainly it could have been much worse had he gotten access to the back part of that facility where there were a lot of other employees.
So security had no reason to be concerned after the shooter's initial visit inside the building?
No, indications were he had a very normal conversation, just inquiring about employment.
Thank you. This will conclude our press conference.
Thank you.